Hello, everyone, and welcome to Software Architecture Monday. My name is Mark Richards, and in this lesson, number 167, we'll take a look at the difference between architecture and design. You can get a listing of all the lessons I do in Software Architecture Monday from my website at developer2architect.com/lessons. So, is there a difference between architecture and design? And it turns out that there is. However, here's something very interesting. The difference between architecture and design is not a binary decision, but rather a spectrum of decisions that lie between architecture and design. So let me show you some criteria that you can use to determine where in this spectrum your architecture or your decision actually lies. The first criteria is whether your decision involves some structural aspect of the system, or is it merely about the source code? Now, when I say the structural aspect, it's the organization of the source code into components and the coupling between those components. Or in distributed architectures, it might be the deployment units, the communication between those deployment units, as well as the communication and types of data and databases you have. These all form the structural aspect of the system. Another criteria that you can use is whether the decision is strategic or tactical. Now, one way to determine whether it's strategic or tactical is to say, for example, how many people need to be involved in this decision, and how long is it going to take to make this decision? Things that are strategic tend to involve a lot more people and take weeks to potentially months to make the decision. Whereas things that are tactical in nature can be decided with one person, maybe two people, within an hour or a day. And so that's a good way of determining whether something is strategic or tactical. The other kind of criteria is whether the decision involves a lot of effort or fairly straightforward minimal effort. The longer or larger or higher the effort, more architectural that decision probably is. And finally, the last criteria is about the trade-offs. Everything in software architecture has trade-offs. Every decision we make has trade-offs, pros and cons. What's the significance of those trade-offs? Is it fairly significant or less significant? Significant trade-offs usually are more on the architecture side of the spectrum, whereas less significant trade-offs are usually more in terms of design. So you might be asking, Mark, why does this really matter? And it's two reasons I can give you. The first is that this helps determine who has the responsibility for making the decision. Now, both here, the architect as well as the development team should always collaborate to get additional information, to get thoughts, ideas, opinions. Maybe there's something we're missing. So I'm not really talking about the collaboration piece, but really after that collaboration, who ultimately has the responsibility for that decision? And then second is knowing when you make a decision. What's the overall impact? Things that are architectural in nature tend to have a higher impact than ones that are design related. So with all this in mind now, let's actually take a look at some examples. I'm going to show you two extreme examples, and then we'll see one that's right in the middle of the spectrum. So for example, right here, what about choosing to use microservices for the new system? And this is an architectural style we saw a couple of lessons ago. Well, let's go through our criteria to see whether it's architecture and design. You see, because you might say, oh, well, that's obviously architecture. But why is it obviously architecture? Is choosing to use microservices more about the structure of the system or more about how we code? And in this case, it's definitely more about the structure of the system. It's an architectural style that we happen to be using. Is the decision to use microservices more strategic in nature, or is this a quick tactical decision? How many people are involved, and how long will this decision take? You might guess weeks to months, and a lot of people are going to want to be involved in this decision, so it tends to be more strategic. What about the level of effort? High effort or low? Well, those of you who have experienced microservices know this is pretty high effort. And finally, what about the trade-offs? Are there significant trade-offs or less significant trade-offs? And here, it turns out there's a lot of significant trade-offs with microservices. For all the superpowers we get with great fault tolerance, great things about scalability, elasticity, we pay the price with high cost, very complex systems, and also sometimes a lack of performance. These trade-offs tend to be fairly significant, especially when we start to talk about physical bounded contexts and data, and it's like, okay, you've convinced me, they're significant. So we can see that is why this is on the far end of the architecture side of the spectrum. But let's do a different kind of decision. You choose to use the strategy design pattern for a part of your code. Well, is this structural in nature, or does this have to really do with how we write source code? And clearly, this is how we organize and write our source code in class files. Is this a strategic decision that involves a lot of people and a lot of planning and analysis? Or is it fairly tactical, something you can make a decision in an hour or less? Well, it turns out this is a fairly straightforward decision. It's fairly tactical. What's the level of effort? Here, compared to something like building out a microservices ecosystem, is fairly low effort. And finally, there are trade-offs. But how significant are those pros and cons of choosing to use the strategy design pattern? And it turns out they're less significant. And so this is why this falls on the far end of the design spectrum. A development team or a developer would have the responsibility for making this decision. Whereas if you saw with the microservices piece, an architect really should have that responsibility for that decision, even though they should always collaborate with others, such as development teams, business stakeholders, and so on. Well, these two were quite obvious, but let's take a look at another kind of decision. And this is choosing to break up the payment service into separate services, one for each payment type. And so we take credit cards, gift cards, reward points, WorldPay, all these kind of different payment methods. So instead of one consolidated single service, we're going to choose to break it apart. Is that architecture or design? Most of the decisions that you make will fall in this category, those gray areas. So let's use our criteria to see if we can help us decide where in the spectrum this decision fits. Is this structural or code? Well, we're going to have to move a lot of source code, but we are creating additional deployment units and possibly more communication points between those. So this is more on the architectural side of the spectrum. Is this a strategic decision that involves a lot of people and a lot of time, or is it more tactical? Well, here it's neither of those extremes, but it's probably more of a tactical decision. We can make this decision fairly quickly with only a few people. What about the level of effort to break apart this service? Well, we're going to have to create new deployment units, possibly break up the data, so that might be a consideration. But largely, we're moving a lot of source code around to different projects or workspaces. So it's more on the low effort side of the spectrum. Well, you can start to see we're getting kind of close, but we've got one more criteria. What about the trade-offs? Are they significant or less significant? Well, think about it. If we break up that payment service, we may have communication between those, which may impact performance. If we can pay with multiple payment types, we might be impacting data integrity because now we have to have a distributed transaction. But we get much better agility and extensibility and evolutionary architecture to add additional payment types. So we're much better agility. I would say those trade-offs are fairly important and fairly significant. We could potentially derail a part of the system based on this decision. And you can kind of see balancing these, it falls right about here in B, which is more on the architectural side of things. And this is where a lot of your, or I should say most of your decisions will lie. So you can see by using these criteria, we can kind of use this slider bar to really determine, should I, as a developer, be making this decision, or is this something an architect should probably make? And conversely, me as an architect, should I be making certain decisions or defer those to a development team? And this kind of tool helps avoid stepping on each other's toes or making a decision that we probably shouldn't have the responsibility to make. So this has been lesson 167, the differences between architecture and design, and kind of a little tool that you can use to go through this criteria to really determine whose responsibility is this decision. Even though we do collaborate, who should have the ultimate responsibility, and how important is this decision in terms of the overall impact of our system? So thank you so much for listening, and stay tuned in 2 weeks for the next lesson in Software Architecture Monday.